Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on housing solutions, centering community in ownership, control, and long-term affordability. I'm Amy Gilman from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where my work focuses on promoting healthier, more equitable communities. For those of you who don't know, RWJF is the nation's largest philanthropy dedicated solely to health. We support research and programs that help ensure that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to live a healthy life. A stable and affordable home in a thriving neighborhood is essential to good health and well-being, but often out of reach for millions of families in the United States, particularly families of color. Even before COVID-19, we were facing an undeniable housing crisis, with more than 18 million families paying half or more of their income on housing costs. Many live in overcrowded homes in unsafe conditions, in communities that lack access to quality education, transit, jobs, healthcare, and green space. Today, millions more face the persistent threat of eviction. COVID-19 didn't create the current housing crisis, but it has exacerbated it and shined a light on the disproportionate impact of housing instability and eviction risk on Black and Latinx communities, and has led to a growing awareness that things need to change in our country. During this webinar, we'll hear from national and local leaders who will discuss models for community ownership and control of land and housing, and other strategies for creating long-term housing affordability through this pandemic and beyond. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, Miriam Axel-Lute, CEO and Editor-in-Chief of Shelterforce, who will introduce our speakers for today and begin the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So welcome, everyone. As Amy said, I'm Miriam Axel-Lute, CEO and Editor-in-Chief at Shelterforce magazine. As many of you know, we're an independent national publication covering community development and housing justice. And, excuse me, and I lose my place on my screen. We publish several times a week, thank you, including reported stories, explainers, and voices from the field. And I hope that you'll join our mailing list to get updated weekly on what we've published if you're not there already. Before I get into the topic at hand for today, I just want to take a moment to personally acknowledge that with the recent police violence in Brooklyn Park and the re-traumatizing experience for many of us of observing the Chauvin trial, this is a difficult time for many people, especially for our Black colleagues and especially for those in the Twin Cities area. And I want to acknowledge how draining it is to live in a white supremacist system based on state violence. It's draining all the time, and especially now. And I want to call on all of us to extend grace to those around you who are particularly affected, as well as, of course, committing to take concrete action for change. As it relates to our conversation today, I want to suggest that police violence is connected to segregation and unequal opportunity in neighborhoods. And to reach the end goals of healthy communities, we must not only invest in things like permanently affordable housing, but also divest from systems like law enforcement that perpetuate harm. So moving on to today's topics. Over Shelterforce's 46 years of looking at affordable housing, and certainly in the 20 or so that I've been associated with it, permanent affordability, community ownership, and community or democratic control of housing have been recurrent themes. And they are related to each other, and they are complementary strategies. But before we delve deep into some of how they work, I wanted to set a little bit of the stage by noting that they are distinct concepts that don't always overlap fully. So for permanent affordability, the reason we talk about permanent affordability is that we are and have been losing affordable housing units at an alarming rate. As rental subsidy contracts and tax credits expire, we lose units to disinvestment and to price appreciation. And in many places, this is happening much faster than we can create new housing that is affordable. So maintaining affordability in perpetuity and setting up systems where that is what we're creating, as opposed to something that has those expiration dates, can have a far more stabilizing fiscally effective and cumulative effect on fighting the affordable housing crisis. There are different ways of achieving permanent affordability, and many of them have to do with changing who actually owns land or buildings. So removing housing from the speculative market and putting ownership into the hands of a different kind of group. That could be a public agency, a cooperative of tenants, a land trust, or a traditional housing nonprofit. Some of these feel more or less like community ownership, but they're all different from trying to get affordability by trying to incentivize for-profit owners in competition with speculation. And neither permanent affordability nor community ownership removes the need for ongoing resources to maintain this housing. Depending how you define community, community control doesn't necessarily follow from either of the above things, though they're often connected. And there are different kinds and degrees of community control, from a large national organization that maintains affordability but makes all its own decisions, maybe taking some modest resident input, to a group that is fully democratic with an elected local board. And there are many variations in between. And there are places for housing with a mix of these levels of community control, but it's, I think, important to note that if it's one of the goals, it needs to be intentionally introduced and cultivated in its own right. Today, I have the honor of serving as a moderator for this fascinating discussion, and I'm really excited to hear from our panelists today about how they're thinking about and engaging with all three of these strategies in their work and what they find that it will require to move the work forward. So our speakers today are Devin Culbertson, the Senior Program Director at Enterprise Community Partners and SPARCC, Roberto de la Riva Rojas, co-director of Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or United Renters for Justice, and Andrea Ponza, President and CEO of Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. Today's webinar is going to be structured similar to a conference panel, so there will be time for questions and answers from all of you, our audience members, at the end. To ask a question, we ask you please use the chat box feature. And if you're having technical difficulties, like you can't hear us or you can't see the slides, please use the raise your hand feature. This discussion is being recorded, and the recording, along with all the resources we mentioned, will be shared with you after. As a reminder, all participant lines are muted. Please use the chat box feature to share your questions and your comments. So we're going to start by talking with Devin. And we're going to open up by talking about community ownership models, particularly community land trusts. So Devin, can you talk about both community land trusts and the concept of community ownership in general, and why SPARCC has explored these models?
Sure, happy to do that, and start by saying thanks for having me, and thanks to Robert Wood Johnson. We've had so many teachers through the last few years at SPARCC that I appreciate the chance to kind of pay it forward a little bit and talk about a little bit of our experience. So to start with, SPARCC is 3 national intermediaries, collaborative tables in 6 different regions across the country, and we're working to support community-led approaches to advance racial equity, climate resilience, and improve health. So there's a lot under the SPARCC umbrella, and we're really looking for things that are intersectional rather than additive, so that we're sort of naturally benefiting all those things as we move forward in the work. And iterating with these 6 sites through starting in 2016 really brought us to a focus on displacement and investment that drives displacement. And from there, we really landed on thinking about community ownership in a relatively broad way. And that was, we came to that from threads of folks really interested in increasing sort of agency and community control among tenants and residents, building community power, the ability to sort of preserve affordable housing in high cost and gentrifying markets, and then more recently a real focus on building wealth in community and among community members. And so there's a lot of structures there. Before I jump into those, I'll just really point out that what we found is that it's really critical that whatever structure you choose follows a real clear understanding of what your goals are in doing that. So for example, there's a lot of the traditional affordable housing really has a focus on reducing the rent paid by the tenant. And so that model and that approach does that thing well. But if you're looking at some of these other goals that I mentioned, you need to sort of look a little bit more deeply at what it is you're trying to achieve. So in some of the program materials that were circulated, there's a link to a blog where we have kind of an incrementally evolving framework that really breaks down the different kinds of goals that we've seen and the approaches to get there. There's a lot of CLT efforts, and those community land trusts really, the structure is that there is a trust that owns the land, and the buyer buys just the house, separated typically on a ground lease from that. We've also worked with a handful of REIT-like models, somewhat like the Community Investment Trust in Portland, and folks try to replicate that around the country, where folks in community are shareholders typically in commercial property, so they're owners in that sense, but don't have day-to-day control over that. And then from our perspective, because we're really thinking about community ownership as ownership by the people and organizations that are in that community, we also look at sort of direct organization ownership, which from the outside might seem somewhat similar to the affordable housing model, but one of the key differences is really focusing on the organization having complete ownership rather than being sort of a general partner with a very small ownership share, and therefore very little control long-term about what happens to that property once restrictive covenants burn off, et cetera. And in that, we also think about direct ownership by community members. And so that could mean things like homeownership initiatives, but for us, it's things like ADU programs that are really trying to sustain low-income owners in place and help them stay in place and grow their wealth over time while hanging on to the asset that they've already acquired.
How did you come to focus on community ownership particularly, and what have you seen as the results when you've started to implement that?
Yeah, our process there was really sort of understanding what the individual efforts were that were happening in 6 different sites, and understanding where the overlaps were, and extracting community ownership as a little bit of an umbrella from the CLTs that we work with. So folks in LA, folks in Atlanta, folks in the Bay Area doing a lot of community land trust work that we were able to help support with financial investments and things like that. The Denver ADU program that's really focused on sustaining those low-income owners, and then a lot of organizations who were responding to the needs in their community and trying to directly buy whether it's commercial property or in some cases residential property. And so we saw that need as a clear through line that required, in some cases, financial support, in some cases technical assistance, often just sort of peer sharing and model sharing. We are not the experts in any one of these models, and so, but in partnering, we were able to bring a national perspective and start to graft information and lessons from place to place. And in doing that, not just look at the model as an object to transfer from place to place, but really understand the context and sort of the enabling elements that made that work or struggle in the places that it did. And so in doing that, we're incrementally helping some of those land trusts continue to make acquisitions and continue to grow their portfolio, and bring other partners into a model that might be more resident-led than they had seen before, or have a little bit of a different sort of financial structure or ownership structure than was common.
Great. Devin, there's a lot of interest in community land trusts right now all across the country. Can you say a little bit more about how you've seen them work and which particular challenges they're really best suited for? So
focusing narrowly on community land trusts, I think that those have done really well when they are set in a broader network. We have seen a lot of sort of individual sort of neighborhood scale CLTs or projects that aren't part of either a land trust with a longer history or ones that are disconnected from other elements of the community. And what it takes for a community land trust to get started is all of the organizing work to sort of organize community, and then all the organizational work to stand up that organization. And it's important to understand so many things in putting that together. So as I mentioned, you need to understand your goals, but you also need to understand sort of the context. You know, in some cases, folks starting community land trusts are really looking closely at building wealth. But you need to understand what kind of wealth you're building and how folks might access that. So there's all of that work to get that started. But then you're making a multi-generational commitment to the homeowners who are your partners in that. And so being able to sustain that and sustain the fundraising and the community support to have that move forward just requires such a broad network to lift that up and move it forward. That seems to be one of the really key elements in to making those organizations work. In terms of the specific goals that I think that they're best suited for, I think its best function is as an anti-displacement tool. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of other challenges in terms of trying to conflate that with building wealth and other things. And I think that they're particularly effective when they are forward-looking and have, frankly, the luxury of being able to start to think about that and start to do some of that before it's reactive to market forces that are already pushing folks out, because the financial hill to climb is so much larger and requires so much more public support once the displacement of the market pressure is that advanced.
Yeah. So you referred to this a little bit, but the idea of not owning the land on which your house sits has unfortunate connotations for many Black Americans particularly. And yet the first community land trust was created by Black folk in the South as a self-sufficiency and an equity move. And modern CLTs are increasingly serving communities of color. So can you talk about how CLTs could be employed as a racial equity initiative?
Yeah, this is a real issue. I know a CLT director in the South that sort of diffuses some of the tension around this by joking about selling people half a house. But it's real, and folks are worried about it. And I think that the tools of real estate and finance can be used and are used for good and evil all the time. And people of color in this country, particularly Black folks, should have a healthy degree of skepticism for something that seems new or doesn't quite seem right to them. That said, I think that there are some elements that are common to CLTs and most community ownership structures that are just kind of categorically a step in the right direction. So having a certain percentage of community members on the board as decision makers in those organizations are important. The intentional outreach to folks that are denied access and opportunity for ownership, and building those relationships that I mentioned before and kind of socializing this model and this need in the community are really critical. That said, I think that really making sure that you're understanding that context as well, and making sure that you're not doing harm, I think it is really important. Some folks really are looking, Black folks in particular, are looking to have access to the opportunities that for generations they hadn't had, and a lot of those are wealth building opportunities. And so making sure that if you're thinking about CLTs as a wealth building structure, there's a way to truly deliver that. And I think, and the last piece I'll say is just sort of coming back to that multi-generational stewardship piece. There is so much interest in CLTs right now that there are so many new CLTs, at least from what we've seen, being created, being conceived, that commitment to being that long-term partner and being able to sort of resource and sustain that is really important. There are folks I was talking to folks earlier this week that said that homeowners are asking them, well, what if the CLT goes away? Which is something that they had not even considered. But as a good partner, you have to, because you own the land underneath people's homes. So I think that as a practitioner, making sure that you really understand and business plan for the long game, and that you're able to sort of show up in the ways that you're making a commitment to.
Great. Thank you, Devin. I'd like to turn now, and I think we're going to come back to some of those questions about CLTs and how they work in the Q&A session. But right now I'd like to turn to Roberto from United Ventures for Justice, which has an incredible story. More than 100 tenants of 5 different buildings formed a coalition, fought against their landlord, mobilized for better conditions, resisted evictions, and won a major victory. So Roberto, can you share that story with us? Tell us how you were able to build that coalition and why, as a result, you decided to turn these buildings into a resident-owned cooperative.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm coming at you live from the Cielo Sin Límites Cooperativa, or Cooperative, Sky Without Limits Cooperative. And I'm kind of emotional today. I'm very emotional today. We're from Minneapolis. Our office is in George Floyd Memorial Square, half a block from the murder. Our cooperative of 5 buildings is in Ground Zero, in the neighborhood that the uprising in the defunct 3rd Precinct was. And so we feel and we hold and we carry and we love through all these intensities. And I want to just say today that when I go through these slides, when we go through these slides together, I want you to hold in your head a few things. One is that we are making the impossible possible. And what I mean by that is I know in this webinar, Miriam, when that article came out about us in Shelterforce, it helped carry the water to push us to hope. These were the kinds of things that opened up. Devin, when we hear about community land trust, we are of the same ilk when we're trying to common spaces, take this out of the private market. And Andrea, who's going to speak after me, the connection of pushing the narrative of deeply affordable units. We are the same and we can radically transform. And I want you to think about mass violence in housing. I'm going to put that in the limelight, that we're fighting against mass violence in housing by creating community over commodities. These are generations of property that has taken the life out of people. And so what I want to say today is, you can move to the next slide, is we're a tenant organization that we've been founded for 5 years. And we've organized against many different landlords, many different corporate landlords, but I'm going to tell you a story today of a landlord who was one of the biggest landlords in Minneapolis, 69 buildings. You would be connected to Stephen Friends. You know a person who has lived in his units. It's 1,500 units, 5,000 people. And what we did is we started very deeply meeting with people in a circle about the abuse. When we first started meeting 4 years ago, there was 2 complaint-driven inspectors for over 90,000 units. And so the city was essentially letting this happen. And through organizing, through people showing up, we were able to make a change and a push for what we really wanted. It was this asamblea method, you could go to the next slide, in which people came together and said, let's think about the patterns of abuse, let's understand each other, and then let's show up in spaces that we're not supposed to be and say what we want militantly. In the last 5 years, we've returned over $13 million back into tenants' pockets, and we've stopped more than 1,000 evictions. And you can move to the next slide. And by doing this, this is Stephen Friend's mansion, right? He's on Lake Harriet, one of the kind of richest areas in Minneapolis, where we just showed up with the entire block. And we showed up saying, we want you to negotiate. We need to stop the violence, mass infestations of cockroaches, no heat in the winter, mass mold. Many BIPOC communities are essentially feeding the wealth of this corporation. He was receiving over 70% profit margins. And this is the thing that's sickening about it, because you can operate a business and still make boatloads of money without oppressing people. But we see time and time again that things get siphoned out of BIPOC communities at the expense of single mothers, children, and our neighborhoods that we've been struggling in. Next slide, please. You can see here, we kind of galvanized the 4-year struggle to connect people to making this a hot issue. So these are tenants in the front of the room you see here actually talking to community members about what we can do to defend evictions. As the 4-year process heated up, there was intense protests at the city. There was many court actions. There was showing up at the landlord's office and getting people activated. The single family homeowners on our block all know about us, all have been to community block parties with us, and all are building with us. And so we're changing the way that we relate to each other. Buildings no longer are these places of blight. They are now places of community where renters can step up, move up from their truth instead of being ignored and move to a next step. Next slide, please. This was a processional that we organized in. We actually protested Stephen Friend's church. We served him a subpoena while he was praying, but this is a place where the entire cooperative actually went to this Catholic church. It was a white Catholic church. There are many Catholic individuals in our cooperative that we actually said, this is a moral issue. Negotiate with us, sell us the buildings. Let us actually get what we want, and let's put it into the limelight. Next slide, please. This was just another set of slides in which we were praying, we delivered flowers to the parishioners, and we made a big deal out of this. We connected to the Archbishop as the 4-year struggle was going. Next slide, please. So what I want to stop there and just say that these actions, we've had more than 450 asambleas. And when I say asambleas, that's people coming together, tenants coming together to learn about a way forward, to learn about how we're going to change the narrative. And that's how we break down and build a community process. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Roberto. And that is, yes, I echo the people in the chat saying this is such an inspiring story. Amazing organizing, incredibly powerful. And then I want to refer back to something that Devin kept bringing up, which is then there's also this question about building an organization that is going to help sustain that access to that housing going forward, which is a somewhat different skill set than running an organizing campaign. So can you tell us about how the cooperative is moving into acquiring the new skills that they need to have to move into this new phase of ownership, and also protecting your ability to continue to do this great organizing while taking on the kind of tasks that are of a different character?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question, because when you're organizing against an enemy, a terrible landlord, it's easy to galvanize and bring, well, it's not easy, but to galvanize and bring people together to push back. But when you actually have to unlearn the deep-seated processes of property within yourself, it becomes a new story. And I think something that has been very prevalent for us is trying to figure out how we can connect to where we want to go. And what's clear to us is that in these different portfolios, the landlords that we organized in, they were in what was called naturally occurring affordable housing, but it was clear that it was naturally occurring profitable housing for the landlord. And so to unseat that, we need to force and push them, organize them to sell the buildings back to the tenants so that we can create the model ourselves. And we have kind of a conglomerate, a mixture of things where there's an interim process right now where, because we galvanized so hard, the city threw down. They said, we're not going to let these tenants go high and dry and be evicted. So we're going to put our own stake and our own money into it because we made such an issue. We have LISC connected to this, as well as the Twin Cities Land Bank, in which we're actually figuring out what our cooperative model is and who we are and who is our identity to have the buildings be sold back to us. Could we cue up the slides again real quick? If we move, yeah, so this is Maria Zavala. 4 years ago, she was being evicted by Stephen Friends, and she was on dialysis, and she would have nowhere to go. We stopped this eviction, and she became one of the strongest fighters for our organization. She passed away just as we won the cooperative at the height of the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. In this, we did many different things to honor her, and we still are honoring her in terms of painting a mural on one of the most important corridors in Minneapolis for the Latinx community. Next slide, please. And we did different ceremonies. And what I want to paint to you is that this is a space that we're not only just renting, we're changing the idea of rent into an idea of community and connection where we know our neighbors. When there's conflict, we look at each other heart to heart and we try to move to a next step to see where we should go. But everybody has in their head this idea of if you act poorly, you should be evicted. And this is a type of violence that has been trained in our bodies that we need to reframe and reposition. Next slide, please. This was just a beautiful time when the court process is such an intense, scary, white supremacist model that pushes people away. So what do? We have pizza parties in court. We bring the kids, we paint on the windows, and we fill the courtrooms to let the judges know that we're here, we're present, and we are not going to stop until we will be heard. Next slide, please. This is a time, this was a really beautiful photo where the court, we filled it so much that we didn't even have enough seats. And the lawyers of the landlord were trembling in their boots, and so they requested security. And so I said, when these lawyers walk through these doors, look them in the eyes, let them know we're here. And so can you imagine opening those doors and then seeing tenants show up in troves of their buildings, right? These are tenants that people are saying that they aren't producing community, that they're transient, that they don't care about neighborhoods. But we kind of just queered that whole model and that idea in this 4-year process. Next slide. This was an assemblea post-court talking about what we were doing, how we were moving, what we were building, what we saw in court. We're always getting together with tenants, trying to reflect, trying to build and learn from what we've seen. Next slide, please. I'll stop there, Medium. I have a few more slides, but I'll stop there to see if there's another question.
There was a quick question in the chat about how online Zoom court has affected what you're able to do in terms of presence in housing court.
Yeah, it was very new for us. We've been pushing for cancel rent, and we've been just building representation for it. And so we're still thinking of creative models to figure out how to do it. We've done it a little bit. There is still some physical court too, but I think the most key thing is to have tenants understand the process, know how to get on, be there with them, be in community so we can all join in Zoom and watch together so that we're not alone in the process.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move on to Andrea now, but I know we're going to come back to a lot of details about what you did and how you did it. I'm going to move to Andrea Ponzer, who can share her insights on preserving affordable homes in communities where residents are at risk of displacement. So, Andrea, in a recent report with the Center for Community Investment, you wrote about how the U.S. is losing existing affordable housing at an alarming rate. For every new apartment created, 2 are lost to deterioration, abandonment, or conversion to more expensive housing, which means without preserving what we have, we fall 2 steps back for every step forward. So talk about what SAFE is doing to combat this trend and how you promote community control of land and housing in the preservation work that you do.
Sure, thanks Miriam. It's great to be here with all of you. For those who don't know, SAFE, Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, is a policy and practice collaborative of 13 nonprofit multifamily affordable housing developers who are working together to advance the creation and preservation of healthy, sustainable, and affordable rental homes that foster equity, opportunity, and wellness for all people. So we think a lot about preserving affordable homes, and we're committed to permanent affordability. This is a little different than a lot of the community ownership we've been talking about so far. Miriam opened us up by talking about, opportunities to remove homes from the speculative market that may eventually result in displacement or double down on the inequities we've already seen. And that's part of our member role, and our role as a collaborative of these members is to think about how you do take those homes out of the speculative market and make them quality, welcoming, and empowering places to live permanently. So that's what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. The members are buying and trying to operate better places for people to live and do that alongside of them. This is a challenge, even at scale. Even if you're a robust nonprofit, just getting a hold of those properties can be challenging to preserve them. So on the policy front, some of what we're doing is looking around and saying, what are the practices to promote notice and opportunity to potential purchasers before something goes to market and becomes subject to sort of that speculation and rising price pressure. And often that's an opportunity too to say to residents or to community groups, this is about to happen, or organize, find partners, and create that opportunity to partner with organizations like ours or amongst yourself and take control of that housing in one way or another. You know, we partner with community groups as well to identify opportunities in communities where the members are already working, figuring out how you do become aware of places that may benefit from preservation and be best kept in the community, and working alongside residents to do that in a way that honors the resident vision for the community and ensures that they can remain. And then broadly too, we're coming together to promote the value of mission-driven owners and the kinds of partnerships and resources they can bring that are additive and not extractive to communities. There are a lot of people doing this work and taking advantage of subsidies to create affordable homes, but they may or may not be in it for the long term. And that's not always just dependent on the tax status of your organization, but really putting the mission and that commitment to permanent affordability at front. Now, so what does community control look like? If it's owned by a national nonprofit or a regional nonprofit, it can be a few things. And we're seeing an evolution right now in how our members look at it. First and foremost, it's allowing the people in the community to remain living in the community, but that's not really enough if you're doing things to them and operating properties in ways that, candidly, maybe really are informed by generations of racist ideologies about who lives in homes that are affordable and in some of the communities where we work. So really thinking about what are the other ways to do this. We've got a long history of partnering with resident groups, particularly in markets like DC, where there's a tenant opportunity to purchase, or areas where there are notices where residents may assemble and say, look, we don't want to develop this, but who's a good partner for us to work with? Our members do a fair amount of that, and partnering alongside community development corporations as well that retain some local control and voice. There are plenty of times when policy environments, financing tools, and timelines don't make that easy for organized groups, particularly if they're not already ready. So looking at models where there may be new ways of going about that too. We're spending some time as a collaborative kind of pushing on that and saying, what are the lessons we've learned from these other ways? What are the tools we haven't been using? How should we be thinking differently about bringing residents into ownership structures and decision-making? But even where you see tenants and residents of the community not in the immediate ownership structure, we recognize increasingly that it's an imperative that you're putting decision-making power in the community, regardless of whose name is on the deed, and that happens throughout the process. Our members think a lot in the design process. If they're going into a community and acquiring or building something for the first time, and they're constantly learning from one another about, how better do we recognize and work with leaders in the community to let them help drive decisions about what we're doing here. But it's not just that moment. I love Roberto used the words, put the life back into the community instead of being extractive. And I think part of how we do that is not just thinking, do you want a community garden, or what are the trees we should save, or the neighborhood history we should honor, but every decision about how you're operating a property and really fostering the agency of the community, giving them that self-determination and ability on an ongoing process to say, this is our home, and we should have a voice in how things are being carried out in the property, whether we're renters or not.
Great. These properties that get the term naturally occurring affordable homes it's not generally actually natural, as Roberto mentioned. And it tends to be a combination of longstanding public decisions about investment and disinvestment and deferred maintenance and what we let landlords get away with. But they do house a large percentage of lower income individuals. And for the smaller scale ones, many are owned by individual landlords who may not have the resources to weather an economic downturn, and people are worried about those properties getting snapped up by these larger corporate landlords. What are some policies, what can be done at the various levels of government to preserve the affordability of these properties and keep them in local ownership?
Yeah, I think you started by highlighting something really important, Miriam, which is that this is not natural, the natural affordability. And because we've made policy and investment decisions for decades that have made it not natural. it should be the most natural thing in the world that you can afford a stable and healthy and welcoming place to live. But instead, we've created policies around land use, investment, wages, and a larger set of social safety nets that have made it unnatural. So as we think about housing, we need to think about all of those upstream causes too, and that if we really want these long-term solutions, I think as housers, we increasingly recognize we have to lend our voice in that space. But you're absolutely right. We've got a disproportionate number of people of color and people with lower incomes living in what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. And many of those smaller apartment communities are also owned by people of color and people of recent immigration status who have seen that as a way to provide for their family and maybe provide their own stability as well. One of the things we need to be doing is making sure that there is widely available rental assistance and safety nets out there, and that it is fast and flexible so that renters remain stable in their homes and so that those landlords too can keep that housing affordable. What we don't want to see is them forced into selling something to someone that's going to apply pressure and push the rents upward, a value add purchaser necessarily. It's not just rental assistance, though, recognizing that we need flexible resources for those landlords to be good landlords, to invest in the community and not be extractive, to make this a quality place to live if they choose to be that owner, or a path for them to sell to the residents or sell to someone who's going to maintain permanent affordability in that community. So I think thinking a lot about how you get that rental assistance out the door as fast and as flexibly as possible, and being mindful that we've got to keep these landlords at the table too. I think there's a desire to, demonize in some cases because it's a stressful time and people are seeing landlords poised to evict. I think there are many that do not. And I think Roberto brought a spirit of saying in some of their organizing and asambleas of saying, work with us, let us help us figure this out. If you don't want to do this, come alongside us and come up with a solution. And I think that sort of posture is the helpful posture in approaching our policymakers too, and saying we collectively have to solve this. Beyond that, first is figuring out where these properties are. We think a ton about where is the naturally occurring housing and how can we be part of a solution. Figuring out who owns it and where it is huge. And that's where working together as a community and saying this is where I live and who I pay my rent to, but also saying to your local government and community institutions, we need to collaborate to identify these things and put in place a system so that we're not surprised when something goes away, but we can see it coming and planning for it. And then also creating resources for those things. There are some great examples out of the District of Columbia of preservation of that kind of housing and a coordinated strategy to identify it. Similarly, in other jurisdictions like Minnesota and Colorado, they're thinking on the more traditional affordable side, but great lessons learned. And then there's notice requirements I talked about before. No one should be caught off guard that their building is sold. Residents deserve to know, and community institutions and partners that may be able to lend capital and expertise should know as well.
Okay. Great. So we're going to move quickly into now, thank you, Andrea, to our audience and questions. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions beforehand and in the discussion. We have a lot of them. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately, but I'm going to ask our panelists to turn their videos on and to support, try to answer things as succinctly as possible so that we can get a number of these in, though many of these are very rich questions. I'm going to start, Roberto, there's some questions about how you funded the work along the way, your years of organizing. Did the city support the tenants? What help did you receive from the city and other organizations?
Yes, thank you. As we galvanized, as we became kind of center narrative in the city, we were able to generate a lot of donations. So we came up with our own fundraising campaign. And when we came up for the purchase, finally, the landlord, Steve Friends, and his business partner, who were acting illegally, this is a whole other story, but they finally said, okay, we'll sell the buildings to you. After us being so stubborn. And it was about a $7 million purchase. But these buildings were sucked dry, right? Mm-hmm. There wasn't any repairs in them. And so the total development cost was roughly around 10 million. So the city threw down with about a $3.4 million loan that if we can maintain affordable in the cooperative, that can be, creative. List came up with a bunch of money. We raised a bunch of money, and the land bank threw down a bunch of money to buy and hold. So right now we're in the buy and hold stage and the refinancing stage. So that's when we're reaching out to the Devins of the world, to the Andreas, to really talk and figure out how we're going to finance this through donations, through a finance model, through we're talking to the public housing agency right now, and we're kind of building that model and shell.
Great. I'm going to combine two other questions right now. So, and then this is for each of you, but really quickly, if you can tell us how you define community when you're trying to talk about community control, and then explain how the people represented by that community are represented in the governance of your organization. So SAFE or SPARCC or United Renters. Devin, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, defining community is certainly slippery, and we don't have a single definition for that. And don't mistake that for being monolithic. I think it really depends on the project that we're talking about, or be that real estate work, be that policy work, and looking for evidence of not just a community resident or organization sort of spearheading that, but that there's sort of a network to other folks in the community, that there's more than one voice from a place or neighborhood, sort of speaking to that issue. And then the community representation within each of the 6 sites is different and determined by those collaboratives, and so they've just decided that for themselves. Folks want to go deeper in that, happy to connect offline or share some materials on that.
Great. Andrea?
So I would echo some of Devin's thoughts around, being careful not to think of community as a monolith. I think how we think of it depends a little bit on sort of the project and the opportunity for engagement we're thinking about. When you're talking about the redevelopment of a site, you're talking about the larger community and who are the faith leaders and the civic leaders and the shop owners. Often the first stop is the bodega across the street saying, who else should I be talking to? When we're talking about, the rules of the road for how you're going to govern yourself as an apartment community and how you're going to use your community space, that's probably the immediate residents of the building. So being mindful and thinking about what is the sphere of control and influence in each piece. On governance, it varies among our members. We are a collaborative of these entities talking about how they're doing their business, that we have recently changed our own governance to make room on the board for people who are working in this space but have lived experience and bring greater and racial and ethnic diversity. Our members have a variety of governance structures at the corporate level that bring in, residents or people with lived experience, but then they may also have local and regional opportunities for folks to participate in governance of their communities or sort of regional entities overseeing development across a state or multi-state area.
Thanks. And Roberto?
Yeah, can we queue up the slide real quick? Slide 22. Is that possible? As we queue it up, I just want to say that all of our board of directors comes from the struggle, and in the cooperative, we're doing the same thing. And so I want to highlight transparency. It's easy to be a king or a queen and make a decision, one person doing it, but to build alignment with 200 people takes work and it takes time. So this is a question of the Good Government Board, which are deep leaders of the buildings that have carried an organizing process and cooperative process together, that are learning conflict resolution values together and where we want to go. We don't necessarily know the exact framework of what it's going to look like, but we know we need to do it together, and that we can't move forward until we step and move together. And so it moves at the speed of trust. And unfortunately, you cannot move that quickly when you're building trust. And you have to be patient. And you always want to go fast, and there's always urgency, but at the speed of trust, we learn the new world.
That's great. I see a couple of very technical questions about how CLTs and cooperatives work that I think we might be able to, I think even I can offer a little bit of answer to, and if anyone else wants to jump in on them. One was just about the difference between cooperatives and land trusts. And I think on a legal structural level, a land trust is a separate entity that has representatives on the board, usually a third residents, a third other community members, and a third committed stakeholders, that owns land and may sell or operate a range of things on that land. A cooperative is the cooperative corporation. People are members of that. If you live in a cooperative building, you are a member, you own shares in that organization, which then the organization owns the whole building and the land. So it's slightly different structures, and it's slightly different governance as well. And what how you choose one or the other has a lot of different factors that go into it. And I'd love to hear Devin and Roberto weigh in on those factors. The other question here was just a little bit about wealth building and community land trusts, which Devin referred to. The question notes that land value is what appreciates and house values depreciate, which I appreciate getting mentioned. I don't think that gets mentioned enough, but the way that it usually works with land trust homeownership is that there is a resale formula that the purchaser agrees to, so that they do get for themselves some of the appreciation of the land if the land appreciates. And most CLT homeowners do build enough equity to purchase a house on the open market if they choose to, but there's a limit so that they don't acquire windfall profits if values shoot way up, so that the house remains affordable going forward to the next owner. Devin or Roberto, do you want to add anything on those topics?
Yeah, two quick thoughts. One on CLT versus the co-op. One thing to think about too with the CLT is there's sort of the legal structure of the trust, but there's also the organization that operates it. And so some of the folks that we're working with are as interested in the organizational infrastructure for their community as the legal ownership structure for the property. Because that, for a lot of folks, there isn't an organizational infrastructure to do fundraising, to apply for statewide grants, things like that. And so they're looking for that group to bring resources to the community for housing projects, and also do other things like during COVID, we saw a lot of fundraising for folks who couldn't cover their mortgage or needed emergency food assistance happening from the CLT on behalf of the CLT members and owners. And so there's some organizational infrastructure that sometimes is beneficial there. Particularly, I saw one of the questions asking about regional versus neighborhood level CLTs, and so sometimes those that are more sub-regional or neighborhood scale can do some more of that. The other thing when you start to think about CLTs and wealth building is that, certainly you own the building, but the building is on the land with a ground lease, and so being in a certain location appreciates. And there's also the resale formula. Just kind of a technical way to do it. We've also been talking with some CLTs that are looking at how to allow those single family homeowners to then build ADUs on that property, so they're able to use the ownership structure that they have that allows them to own all improvements on the property, which would include an ADU, to generate income for themselves and their family and build additional wealth that way. So I think that the access to the land becomes very important, even if you don't legally own the actual dirt.
Absolutely. Did you have anything to add to that, Roberto?
Yeah, I would just say that there's not one particular model. And geographically, I think it has to be built with residents, with organizations, and with institutions together. And so, like Devin was saying, we're not necessarily single family, but we're also not multifamily, and we're cooperative, and we're kind of both. And so we're really zeroing in on what our model is going to be. But our model, we understand, needs to be a protection to keep housing in community, because we see other cooperatives get gutted, and then all of a sudden individuals will start selling their units like a condominium model, and then we'll kind of gut the cooperative from the inside out as members become inactive, as different things happen. Around our cooperative right now is a big transit corridor and a bunch of these buildings that really have rents at disproportionately high rates compared to what ours are. And so what we want to do is, how do we moor ourselves for a long-term vision of housing that is in community and that can never be bought or sold, but at the same time allows tenants and residents, users, however we want to frame this, a way to build wealth, and to have a share and a piece that they can use if they happen to want to move out of cooperative.
Yep. And I will note that there are many places that are actually combining cooperatives and land trusts as a way to try to get the best of both of those, to have the land trust sort of be a backstop against the selling off possibility while still having the democratic control and direct ownership of a cooperative. So that's happening in some places.
Miriam, can I say one other thing on wealth and CLTs? I think it's important to really understand what sort of wealth you're trying to build for your community and what folks need, because there's a kind, home equity has been a huge growth engine in this country, and it's been very, very helpful and very successful for people that got legit appraisals, that were upwardly mobile, that were in communities that were where they had home appreciation, that could afford the additional payment if they were going to refinance, or had access to capital and fair lending practices to get access to quality loans. Some people are looking for wealth building for liquidity to cover emergencies. Some people are looking for wealth to generate near-term income to help them sort of manage their expenses each and every month. And so all wealth isn't created equal. And when you think about the kind of wealth that home equity is, it might not be the best kind of wealth for the people in your community. So when we talk about really understanding the community ownership goals, I think you've got to dig pretty deep before you land on a model, because there's some, you may be building the wrong kind of wealth and not actually helping, and in the process consuming a lot of philanthropic resource, a lot of bandwidth, a lot of folks' time. So I think just being well-meaning isn't enough, particularly when you start to land on one model from another place and context and bring it to the people that you're trying to help.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think that's a really important thing. And we have to remember that a lot of the home equity that was built on opportunity hoarding, and that the increases in value were only because opportunity was being concentrated in a very small place. So demand went up there, which is not a thing that we can or should replicate. I'm going to sneak one more question in here. There was how has the public health crisis and interest in social justice affected localities' interest in these alternative ownership structures? Are you seeing more openness to different approaches and localities stepping up and encouraging these different kinds of ownership? Particularly perhaps through health organizations or public health agencies.
I can't say that I have seen that. I think that there has been that all the things surrounding that, including some of the federal resources that have come through, I think have sort of changed some resourcing conversations locally and identify places where folks locally could advocate for resources. So we saw LA County put up $14 million specifically for CLT acquisitions. And so there's a lot that sort of went into that, and a lot that goes into sort of activating that money for organizations that don't have a ton of working capital. But I don't know that it was really sort of the public health context that was the politically motivating factor.
Interesting. Anyone else quickly?
I would say Minneapolis is a peculiar context right now, based in the kind of world historic place that we're in. And people do feel, from our perspective, a little bit more open to think radically and to think outside of reform measures, and to think that, oh, yeah, we are actually creating a lot of oppression, and we need to rewire the way that we've been advancing some things. And so we've seen different organizations, institutions, foundations open up that hole. We think there is a hole right now, a portal, if you will, to see towards the other side. And we're trying to use that to the best of our advantage, I suppose.
Well, I think that's a hopeful note to end on. And I want to thank all of our audience for your excellent questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get to everyone. We could talk about this for hours, I imagine. I want to thank Devin, Roberto, and Andrea for their time. and work to ensure that everyone has a place to call home. If you missed any portion of today's discussion or you just want to revisit it, we will share the recording and all the resources that have been mentioned via email. And so thank you again to our speakers, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.